When you buy groceries, fill up your car, or pay rent, maybe you've heard the news say inflation is too high or coming down. But what does that really mean? All of these changes are linked to one idea: inflation. In this video, we'll answer for questions. First, how does inflation work and where does it come from? Second, why does inflation go up or down? Third, what's the relationship between inflation and recessions? Fourth, is a little inflation between 1 and 3% good or bad, and why? Our goal is to make the idea of inflation simple and practical so you can understand how it affects your daily life and why governments and central banks care about it so much. Let's get started. First, how does inflation work and where does it come from? At its core, inflation means that the general level of prices rises over time. Your dollar buys less. In Canada, we often measure inflation through the Consumer Price Index (CPI), which tracks a basket of goods people buy: food, shelter, clothing, transportation, etc. Let's look at recent Canadian data. As of August 2025, Canada's inflation year-over-year was about 1.9%. Food prices were rising faster, plus 3.5% over the year. Shelter housing rent rose approximately 2.6%. Transportation had a slight decline. Notably, gas prices dropped year over year. If the CPI shows that the overall cost of the basket has gone up by 3% in a year, that means the inflation rate is 3%. So, where does inflation come from? Economists point to three major sources. Demand pull inflation. This happens when demand for goods and services is stronger than supply. Think of a popular concert with limited tickets. If everyone wants in, ticket prices rise. The same idea applies to the whole economy: too much money chasing too few goods. Cost push inflation when costs of producing goods go up. For example, wages, energy, materials. Businesses often pass them on to consumers. For example, if oil prices rise, it becomes more expensive to transport food and run factories. Businesses raise their prices and inflation goes up. Built-in inflation. This is a cycle where workers expect wages to rise to keep up with prices, and when wages rise, businesses increase prices again to cover the higher costs. Wages and prices keep pushing each other higher. So inflation is a mix of stronger demand, rising costs, and expectations, people expecting future inflation. Let's move to the next part. Why does inflation go up or down? Now that we know what inflation is, let's talk about why it changes. Inflation is never steady. It goes up and down depending on what's happening in the economy. So, why inflation goes up? Here are some factors. Strong demand or spending. Strong consumer demand. When people have jobs and money, they buy more, which can push up prices. Supply chain shortages. If factories can't make enough products or if shipping gets delayed, prices rise. Higher costs of production. When wages or raw materials rise, businesses pass costs on to customers. Government and monetary policy. When central banks keep interest rates very low or when governments spend a lot, more money flows into the economy, which can fuel inflation. Then why does inflation go down? Weak demand. When people spend less, businesses lower prices to attract buyers. Improved supply. For example, when supply chains recover after a crisis, products become easier to find. Higher interest rates. When central banks raise rates, borrowing is more expensive, so people and businesses spend less. Stable production costs. If oil, rent, or wages are stable, there's less pressure to raise prices. Here is the real-world example. During COVID-19, many factories closed, shipping slowed down, and demand for goods increased as people stayed home and bought things online. At the same time, energy prices surged. As a result, inflation spiked to levels not seen in decades. To bring it back down, the Bank of Canada and the U.S. Federal Reserve raised interest rates in 2022 and 2023. Higher interest rates made made mortgages, loans, and credit cards more expensive. This slowed demand and helped reduce inflation. So inflation is like a balance. When demand and supply are steady, inflation stays low. When things get out of balance, inflation rises or falls. The third question is, how are recessions related to inflation? Let's connect inflation to recessions. A recession is when the economy shrinks for a period of time. Businesses earn less money, people lose jobs, and spending decreases. How inflation can lead to a recession: if inflation gets too high, the cost of living rises sharply. People cut spending on non-essentials. Businesses face higher costs and lower sales, which may force layoffs or reduced investment. To fight inflation, central banks may sharply raise interest rates, which can slow the economy too much. How a recession can reduce inflation: in a downturn, demand falls. People spend less. Businesses lower or hold off on price increases to stay competitive. Inflationary pressure eases. For example, in 2008, the world experienced the Great Recession. Inflation dropped sharply during this crisis because demand collapsed. People lost jobs, housing markets fell, and spending decreased. Lastly, is a little inflation 1 to 3% good or bad? Why? Why small inflation is often good. Indicator of healthy growth. 1 to 3% suggests the economy is active, not stagnant. Encourages spending and investment. If people expect prices to slowly rise, they prefer to spend or invest instead of just hoarding money. Eases debt burdens. For borrowers, inflation erodes the real value of fixed-rate debt over time. Wage flexibility. It gives room for wages to adjust upward without constant shocks. In Canada, the Bank of Canada aims for approximately 2% inflation as its target range between 1% and 3%. Why too much inflation is bad? Loss of purchasing power. People's incomes may not keep up. Uncertainty and planning difficulty. Businesses and consumers find it harder to plan budgets and investments. Harm to fixed income groups. Retirees or those with fixed incomes suffer. Why too little inflation or deflation is bad? Deflation, prices falling, encourages people to delay purchases, expecting further declines. That reduces demand and slows the economy. So, the sweet spot in Canada is about 2% inflation, enough to support growth, but not so much it hurts. Conclusion and forward look. Let's wrap up what we've learned. Inflation is the rise in prices over time measured by the Consumer Price Index. It comes from demand, costs, and wage cycles. It rises when demand is strong or supply is weak, and it falls when spending slows or central banks take action. Inflation and recessions are closely linked, with each one able to affect the other. Finally, while high inflation is dangerous, a little inflation about 2% is healthy for the economy. Inflation affects everyone. It changes how much we pay for groceries, rent, gas, and even how governments make policies. By understanding it, we can make smarter decisions in our own lives and better understand the news about the economy. Thank you for watching.